But good, Shana Tova.
Shana Tova.
There is continuing on before. Yeah.
8:30 every. I'm aware, but I don't know if everyone would make it, given that it's Rosh Hashanah. But thank you all. No, it's great to have everyone here, and people might trickle in, I imagine.
We never clarified what room it was
What?
in.
Sorry, you found us. Hopefully, people find
Well,
us.
I told the ushers.
The ushers. Okay, so the
The
ushers
ushers
will
will
direct people. I'm glad you found it. I guess it was never publicized. That's we should make sure that it's publicized in the future.
What is Sheila?
No, she was. She'll be.
She had.
But in any case, here we're on page 112 is the Torah reading for the first day of Rosh Hashanah. Page 112 here in the Chumash. Can anyone share with us though briefly? Does anyone know what the Torah readings are?
Rabbi, would you
Yeah.
please announce the chapter and verse 2? I think it's chapter 21, verse 1.
We're in Genesis chapter 21, verse 1. Sorry, for those on Zoom, if you don't have, that's fine. Chumash, we're chapter 21, verse 1. Genesis.
Let's see, second day. I can't even remember.
The second day is the Akedah, the near sacrifice of Isaac.
This must be the first.
And so, today we begin with the chapter prior to that, and then tomorrow we'll read chapter 22 actually of Genesis. But this is the beginning. Vadonai pakad et Sarah, kasher amar. God took note of pakad. We'll look at that word. Took note of Sarah, and did for Sarah as he had mentioned, as he had said. Which, if you recall, the story of the angels, Abraham and Sarah in their tent, said that Sarah would give birth. Right? And she laughed. Right? She laughed because she was so old, according to tradition, right? She was 90 years old. But indeed, she gives birth and names the child Yitzchak, right from that story. So any thoughts why these readings on Rosh Hashanah? Thoughts?
Well, I think all good questions because Rosh Hashanah is really supposed to be the creation.
Interesting. So we learn tradition is that Rosh Hashanah is the birthday of the world, right?
Make more sense of Pesach. The birth of the nation.
Interesting. Okay. Yeah. No, it's an interesting thought. Yeah.
Well,
But it's a new beginning. A new beginning after many trials, right? There's a story of infertility right here. She's 90 years old according to tradition, and it's kind of this miracle. That's why she laughs, that it's impossible.
it's hope. It's hope.
There's hope. And actually today's Haftorah reading is also giving birth. Hannah, who prays for a child is barren, and ultimately gives birth to Samuel, right, who becomes one of the great prophets. Nelson.
Well, God keeps his promises and he forgives.
Okay, God keeps his promises.
And he forgives.
God keeps promises and God is forgiving. Yeah. Any other thoughts?
It's also like the beginning of our history because you have Haggai, you have Ishmael, and you have really the beginning of the Arab.
Okay, in some ways it's kind of, this is going to be the lineage that's going to become the Jewish people, Bnei Israel. Okay, good. There's not necessarily one correct answer here. Yeah.
What are the other names for Russian?
What are the names? Yom HaZikaron. Now that's Yom Kippur, more Yom Teruah, a day of sounding the shofar, and actually that's perhaps maybe the most direct connection on the second day, Akedah Yitzchak, that God tells Abraham to sacrifice his child, his only child. And ultimately God, you can question whether, according to tradition, God passes the test. You can question whether, this is very challenging. In fact, both of these chapters are particularly challenging narratives, especially thinking as a parent of young children. These are questionable examples of parenting, to say that, at the very least. But God, tests, it says in the Torah, God tests Abraham to sacrifice his child, and ultimately, at the last moment, there's a ram caught in the thicket, and a voice emanates from heaven saying, no, we never sacrifice our own children, and here's the ram, and this is the ram where the shofar comes from.
That is a very interesting thought, though. What came first? Obviously, a shofar, it's, you need a horn or some way of announcing things. And it must have been, they blew a trumpet or whatever. And like retrospect, we needed something to announce things. To announce that we're new people, that we're coming, into the world and whatnot. And is that why he caught a ram? Did you tell me? I'm just
Is it
thinking,
because of that? Yeah.
is it sort of reversed? We had to justify, we needed something different again. And it's something that's natural from an animal, not something that we make.
Okay. Right, the shofar was used, and we have record in the books of the prophets as well, that the shofar was used essentially like we might use a trumpet today. It was the call, gather, a call to go to battle.
They didn't have
Shofar blasts.
telephones.
What?
They didn't have telephones.
Before iPhones, yeah. Right. But yes. And in fact, right, the two stories are connected to each other in some ways. If it's about the shofar, we learn how important, let's say, Isaac is in the story in this chapter and what we read today, and so much so, Abraham, at Sarah's insistence and God saying it's okay, actually sends out his other child. And I talked about, the questionable parenting, which we can get into a little. But here Isaac is the one that's left, and now God is asking Abraham to give the one child that's left in his home.
I know that in some of the Hebrew schools, I don't know what they do. I guess some days certain parts of the Bible are left out, like the race of Jesus. They skip over it.
Right.
They don't skip over the Akedah, which is interesting. Because I mean, today our kids are really bright, and,
So it is true that we tend not, we don't, we omit, there are certain stories that we won't teach our children until they're old.
I'm talking about Hebrew Academy.
Yeah, there's certain stories which we may not teach until high school or, until kids are a little older and more mature. The Akedah is one that we teach from a young age. And perhaps also it's a much more seminal story to our narrative than, for instance, the rape of Dinah is. But it is taught, it is a story that we teach our children, when we teach the Torah, even from a young age. So there is a midrash, actually, you mentioned about which came first. There's a beautiful midrash, I don't have the source, I'll need to find it for you, that God put 10 things into the world kind of at the last moment before that very first Sabbath, the sixth day of creation. There's a midrash that there were 10 things that God placed in its spot and were there from the beginning of time, just waiting for the right person to come across it. And one was this ram caught in the thicket. It was waiting there since creation for Abraham to find it and to be able to sacrifice in this moment. The burning bush was also one of the 10 things. Moses' staff, and is also shows somewhat an unease with the miraculous nature. Right, no, yeah, but there, I need to look back, I believe so, yes, but but that shows the unease also that the rabbis had with magic and things that seem supernatural, that these were all things created, there were 10 things created during creation that God brought into the world, just waiting to be found. But it happens that this ram is one of the things, according to the Midrash, that's been there, and is waiting actually. So you could say which came first, but this ram, according to this Midrash, was there from creation, just waiting for this moment.
The thing that makes other people.
So we'll jump back here into the text for today. Those, I think everyone, there were great answers and great thoughts. So I'll read this first sentence again, and any thoughts, and I'll share a little about this sentence. V'Adonai pakad et Sarah ka'asher amar, vayas Adonai l'Sarah ka'asher diber. We're at page 112. If you want to get a Chumash, chapter 21, verse 1 of Genesis. So the Lord took note of Sarah as he had promised, and the Lord did for Sarah as he had spoken. Any thoughts on this verse?
No pun intended, as inconceivable as it was for Sarah, the prayer was finally answered.
Right, the prayer was answered. Good.
Had been different, no, he was 90. And then, Abraham was, anyway, so maybe that's promise.
Okay, good, right, it's taking note, remembering that promise. I also just want to note before we move on, this word pakad has been taken, we now, in the addition of the matriarchs in the Amidah, the word that was taken, by those who kind of added this liturgy, wanted to find a word, a verb that was connected to Sarah in the text, that it wasn't, that there was biblical, Torah reference within, what is a new part of our prayer, but it's rooted in tradition. And so we say, Baruch Ata Hashem, Magen Avraham Ufoked Sarah. At the end, it comes from this verse, that God does take note of and recognizes and remembers and brings blessing to Sarah. And we use that word so that our prayer is still connected to tradition. We could have just said Magen Abraham v'Sarah, that we use that same word that's connected to Abraham also for Sarah. But the tefillah, the writers of tefillah want to always root it in the sources, and that's why the prayer is actually Ufoked Sarah. Yeah.
Another thought, I mean, the great thing about these classes, that doesn't get these crazy thoughts. Well, not seriously, it says, and as he promised. And
Yeah.
I don't know, the story of the Immaculate Conception and the birth of Jesus, if that wasn't taken from this idea. That
Interesting. I can't speak to that. I don't know. I don't know what Christian scholars would say, but it's an interesting thought. It's
no,
yeah.
you could almost take this that God is the one who
Yeah. No, it's an interesting thought.
impregnated Sarah, not Abraham.
Oh, interesting thought. Interesting thought.
Crazy
God
thought.
is behind the scenes, right? Yeah.
Yeah, but it's.
But Jews don't feel God is pregnant. No.
Well,
No, that's not.
I mean,
I think what Sheila's saying, and I don't want to say one way or another, but if I understand what you're saying, of course, right. The Jewish understanding is that Abraham and Sarah had conceived a child. But Sheila is saying, could you read this sentence? And maybe you could. Could you read it as though God is the one who's
I mean, if
impregnating
anybody
or
ever
causing?
thought of this
Yeah.
crazy idea, I mean.
That's interesting.
Yeah, well, the Christians took a lot of these things and interpreted in their own way.
Okay, good. So we'll move on. Is there anyone that wants to read verse 2 here?
It's exactly that.
Okay, Janina.
Verse 4 says.
Sarah conceived.
Sarah conceived and bore a son Abraham. At the set time of which God, Abraham gave his newborn son, whom Sarah had borne, the name of Isaac. And when his son Isaac was 6 years old, Abraham circumcised him, as God had commanded.
Okay, so we'll pause here. Right, so Sarah conceived and bore Abraham a son. At the set time, right? Again, God is behind the scene, and we'll come back to that idea that God is in control. But right, gave the name of Isaac. We mentioned, a reason for that already, a couple parsha. Well, I guess it actually just shortly before this parsha and shortly before our reading, that the angels visit the tents and Sarah laughs, and we have that name Yitzchak, laughter. And here's the first example of a Brit Milah at 8 days. Isaac is the first Jewish person, the first person of Bnei Israel who is circumcised at 8 days old. And it's actually from this verse that we understand and we learn, and our tradition learns that Brit Milah happens for male children at the age of 8 days. Unlike Abraham actually circumcises himself, in old age, to demonstrate covenant with God.
Was he asked to?
Was Abraham asked to?
Yeah.
Yeah, I believe so.
Yeah,
We need to go back to that text.
and he circumcised Ishmael at the same time.
Correct, at 13 years.
Yeah, which is really funny.
Which also connects to the age of maturity, in that particular story. I would need to go back, but yeah, Abraham is commanded to do that and learns that is a sign of covenant already. So he already knows that.
But is there any relation to that and Rosh Hashanah? The forming of the tradition to do these things.
I'm interested, right? I'm probably not according to tradition, but it could be. I mean, it's a nice connection, certainly.
Then we would have had Yom Kippur on the 8th day.
We would have had Yom Kippur.
Yeah, I mean-
right.
Yeah.
Interesting, right? I don't know, but
Why is my idea
But,
crazier than
The
what's
same
here?
thing, I was.
why is it, right? Any idea could have been taken root.
10 days.
That's not what happened. The Torah, the reason Yom Kippur is on the 10th day is because the Torah tells us the 10th day. We don't have a specific reason given for why it's the 10th day, but the Torah says on the first day of the 7th month. Actually, interestingly, and we celebrate it as the new year. The Torah tells us it's the first day of the 7th month of the year.
Yeah.
According to the Torah, Nisan is actually the first month of the year. And we recognize today in the Talmud and later tradition, talks about Nisan is the first month that the Jewish people became a people. The exodus from Egypt happens in the month of Nisan, right? We celebrate Pesach during the month of Nisan. And so tradition says that Tishrei is actually the anniversary of the beginning of the world. Yeah.
What's interesting, the moon is the first thing. I mean, the full moon. Because.
Right, the full moon is the middle.
Because Pesach was the full moon, rather than the moon.
Correct, yeah.
All right, a midrash to be made out of the fact the 8th day, 7 days of creation, or 6 days of creation and Shabbat. And so we continue on the 8th day and we have circumcision.
No, 100%, and I think there's actually something to this in our tradition. We have the 7 days which represent completion, and now we're ready to join into the covenant. The 8th day is after, 7 is our traditional recognition of completion, and so now it's the 8th day. You're ready to take steps. You've been created. You're fully formed.
Okay, so what's
You're ready to take that step forward. What?
Now we need 9 and 10.
I know what. You can go to Academy of Day and find out what 9 and 10 are.
What?
But
No,
here,
one-
The months of.
Yeah, but that's.
yeah, right. But good.
That's not mentioned.
So here we see Abraham, verse 5.
What's the Shema?
That Abraham is 100 years old, right?
When
When Isaac is born, and this is why he's named Isaac. Sarah says, "God has brought me laughter. Everyone who hears me will laugh with me." Tzachok asali Elohim, kol hashomei yitzchak li. God has caused me laughter. Right, as Sarah laughed at this, comment, when the angels came to visit, and now God has caused me this laughter.
That laugh then was laughing that it's gonna happen, this laughter is out of joy. It's a different laughter.
So it's a different laughter. Different traditions, this is where she says, you could say, right, there are different laughters, but laughter is associated with Isaac's birth.
And later again, during when she throws Ishmael out,
Right, we're gonna see the first,
He's just stocking.
Netzach, we're gonna see that, and we'll talk about what this name Yitzchak means, because we're gonna see Yishmael, making fun, making laughter, right? It's the same word, Netzach, which we'll come to shortly.
Intensive.
And right, and here it is kind of laughter that who would have thought, because the next verse, right, she adds, Vatomer mimi lela Abraham henika vanim Sarah ki aladati ben liskunav. Who would have said to Abraham that Sarah would suckle children, yet I have borne a son in his old age? She's still kind of laughing at the fact that she was able to conceive here. And that's, the child grew up and was weaned, and Abraham held a great feast on the day that Isaac was weaned.
They're making the point that this is a miracle, really.
Right. Right, here, there's a great feast, and
They don't,
celebration, right?
with Hannah, it's not a miracle, I mean, it could just have happened. She's not.
In
the
Hannah's
size
case,
old.
she's of childbearing age, she just has been infertile. It's not the same miraculous,
Right,
moment that we see here. But there is,
and isn't, what's her name, Manoah, Samson also?
Samson is also, comes after, they're infertile and praying to God, barren,
Yeah,
and they make a vow saying, if I have a child, I will make a vow to have that child connected to you, and of course, right, Samson makes the Nazarite vow. But here's where things get, it seems all great and good, but then we get to verse 9, and we see things are not so great in the home. Does anyone want to read here, verse 9? Jealousy, yes. Want to read, Eric?
Sarah saw the son whom Hagar the Egyptian had born to Abraham's slave. He said to Abraham, cast out the slave woman and her son, for the son of that slave shall not share in the inheritance of my son Isaac.
Okay, so what's going on here? Sarah saw the son whom Hagar the Egyptian born to Abraham. Right, it's hard for us necessarily to put ourselves in this situation. We don't have this kind of relations today, right? Typically, if you live with someone, in this case, right, Abraham is living with someone and has a child with that person, we think of that person as a partner, as a spouse, not in the way that relations worked at that time. So any thoughts here on what's going on?
Wait a second, you don't think in modern time there are situations like that?
Oh,
Absolutely
there definitely can be. I'm not saying there can't be. It's not how we think of as a traditional relationship. Yeah,
Because I feel like now this is coming out where Sarah's now having an issue with Hagar having a son, where like before when like this whole situation happened to begin with, was Sarah having any misgivings with him bearing a son with somebody else because she was barren?
Sarah encouraged me to have a child. Sarah wanted him to have a child because she felt, I'm not able to have a child, we should have an heir, right?
So that is why I guess for me, I'm just like, okay, but why is it an issue now that now there's another son?
Right, well, it's here, I mean, she said that one of the reasons is specifically right here in the text, right? She seems to be concerned about inheritance, who's gonna be taking, who's going to be bringing the family name forward, who's gonna inherit, everything that they have.
Is that specifically because it has to be the first son who carries it on?
I tell you, the first son is the one who inherits, typically, yes. In this case, I don't know, and I would need to look what the rules are if the first son born was not to the wife, but to a.
well, it seems to say in the notes at the bottom that he would inherit, and yet what is strange is that if he divorces his slave wife, and he sends her away, then they lose all their rights.
Right.
So,
Right.
I mean. I don't know.
So Ishmael, had he lived there, would have been, eligible to have a large share, a large inheritance. portion by virtue of being Abraham's firstborn.
But you could still have a large portion, I mean, again, what is an inheritance here? God's promise is just that you'll have a lot of children. Ishmael could have had property. He could have had, say, more property than was given to Yitzhak, but not, they could have made, what's his name, Ishmael barren.
Well, yes, but it's, that's not what Sarah is not necessarily thinking of inheritance the way God has promised inheritance. Traditionally, inheritance, we know from the ancient Near East, was kind of a double portion of land, of property and material wealth as well. Sarah wants her son to be the inheritor.
You know, but you have to remember, none of our forefathers.
Were the eldest.
It didn't happen that way in any of our forefathers, it's always the second or later
And
stuff.
right, and I would argue, and many Torah scholars or modern scholars have looked at that as a particular point that God decides, right? It's kind of the triumph of God over what you might see as the natural way of things. It was natural in the ancient world. And even still today, where you see monarchs who becomes king, who becomes queen, it's the firstborn.
You know, and
Regardless of ability or regardless of who's most apt for the position.
Like in Saudi Arabia.
Going back to Sarah wasn't able to have kids before. That may not have been so true in those days. If you go back the prior 10 generations, they were all begetting for years.
You're saying in the Torah?
Yeah.
The Torah,
Everybody
yeah,
was
well,
for hundreds of years.
yes, you see that, but that doesn't mean, clearly we see from what the Torah shares that infertility was certainly an issue, you know, that was fairly commonplace or commonplace enough for the Torah to bring, you know, stories and the prophets to bring stories of it. We do, right, at the same time, hear stories of people begetting, you know, 10, 20 children, but I think barrenness in some ways shows the triumph of God over what you might think is the natural way of things, that it's God that's the one who's, well, we don't believe that God impregnated Sarah. God is the one who's making this possible. And the same way I think with the oldest child not being the inheritor. When we see that in all cases, you know, we see that with Isaac. First of all, Abraham is not the firstborn.
We don't know that.
We don't know for sure, but we hear based on the order, we say that Abraham may not be the firstborn. Isaac, we know, is not the firstborn of Abraham.
They were triplets.
Yeah, there's different ways of understanding, but and it doesn't specify in the text. But general tradition, a lot of our traditions state that he wasn't. But Isaac is not. Yaakov, we know, is not. He's the younger. In fact, the older shall serve the younger. We have this prophecy regarding Yaakov. Both Judah and Joseph, neither are the firstborn. Joseph is, I guess, the firstborn of his mother, but not of Jacob. And we can see that, I think, is.
Well, then Joseph did actually end up getting a portion. That's why we have Menashe and Brian.
Yes, eventually, right, we see
So
the oldest, right,
that was a questionable
but
whether or not.
but there's a statement here. I believe there's a statement that it's not necessarily the firstborn, even though this was in a culture where the firstborn inherited a double portion and was seen as the leader, was seen as the inheritor. Judaism was countercultural, I think, and there's a point being made here that just because you think that this is the natural way of things, God is really the one in control and can change that if the right person to lead the community forward is not the firstborn. Yeah.
I was gonna ask if maybe some of what is going on is because Judaism was, I guess, kind of quote unquote getting started, and so they were still used to culturally from where they were coming from before getting started. Do you think that was potentially playing a role in this?
Yeah, well, 100%, yeah, definitely. I mean, Sarah is, and there's a lot of study that's been done on this by modern scholars trying to understand how ancient Near Eastern culture worked. And there's no question that Sarah is recognizing that Ishmael is entitled, and she says, this was the child that God gave us, this child should be the one inheriting, and this is my child, right? There's definitely jealousy in here. This is my child should be our heir, not this other child that's not even mine. I definitely think though that you need to situate the story in its own time and understand the culture that they lived. Yeah.
To be private also is, as you mentioned, the lesson that takes care of them, because same way we're saying that God controls that give birth all age, and that gave God control that He didn't give birth. And in other words, the same way that all of a sudden she wasn't bearing because of God. So because of God's hand in both conceiving and not conceiving, it did allow Ishmael to be born. And so here is a definite lesson saying that God is controlling everything. But the lesson is that you can't always go by, right?
Yeah, no, I do think so. Two things. I do think to some extent, God's hand is in the story and is meant to be in the story. I sometimes worry about that because taken to its, to an extreme logic, to an extreme conclusion today, it creates sometimes very challenging theology where people say, oh, this hurricane happened because you were sinful or you did this. And it's very challenging, and it's not the way we understand the world. But I do think the Torah is written to demonstrate that God's hand, and it's not just happenstance. And in some ways, I see it, a product of its time, almost a polemic against the idea that there's multiple gods vying and fighting against one another. That no, there's one God that's kind of in control and is making things happen. And in many ways is unique in its time because of the nature of monotheism, and there's one God that kind of is overseeing and controlling everything. Yeah, Nelson.
In line 9, Sarah calls Hagar the Egyptian woman, but in line 10, when she talks to Abraham, she emphasizes she's a slave. Are there comments on what's going on in that difference?
In the difference of how she
refers to Hagar.
It's a good question. I'm not sure what commentary has said. I mean, I see, her making her point with Abraham, I think even on base value, she might think her case is stronger by reminding him that Hagar is not really his wife, but rather this slave, that you have no responsibility, let's say, or at least that's what she's trying to convince him, that he has no responsibility to keep her in their household. Perhaps she thinks, and I could think the plain value of the plain meaning of the text, is an argument that by saying that she's an amah, that she's not really, the spouse, that she's not deserving of equal rights. I think can be read very plainly into the text. But I don't know I'll need to look into what commentary says about that difference. But clearly, in the next verse, Abraham is not thrilled with this suggestion. He's very distressed about this. He loves Sarah, but this is his son, Ishmael. And he's very distressed. And actually only does, well, we don't know what he would do necessarily otherwise, but he only does it here after God actually tells him it's okay. Verse 12. God said to Abraham, do not be distressed over the boy or your slave. Whatever Sarah tells you, do as she says, for it is through Isaac that offspring shall be continued for you. As for the son of the slave woman, I will make a nation of him. 2, for he is your seed.
This is what's interesting if you think about it. He doesn't want to get rid of Ishmael, but he takes Yitzchak ready to be sacrificed. They're there, he suddenly goes.
Right, so there's a very different, this distresses him a lot, and then in the next chapter, he's ready and willing to go follow God's lead and sacrifice his child without any.
Yeah,
So it's interesting, you're right, and we see that same hesitation in just the chapter prior. God shares that God's going to destroy Sodom and Gomorrah, Sodom and Gomorrah, because everyone's wicked and evil, and Abraham immediately stands up. What if there were even 50 good people? What if there were even 45 good people? 30, 20, 10? In fact, we get the notion of 10 as the requirement for a minyan, because God is able to convince, or Abraham is able to convince God, let's say. We could argue whether God knew that this was going to happen, but Abraham kind of declares, and God accepts, that if you have 10 good people, that's a community worth saving, even if everyone else is wicked and evil. Of course, there are texts that say God knows that there aren't even 10 good people in Sodom and Gomorrah, but where is that fight that Abraham had? That Abraham's willing and ready to argue with God for 50 innocent people, 10 innocent people that he doesn't even know. Here it's his own child. So it's an interesting point. I want to jump back here before we move forward to verse 9. So I don't know about the Egyptian, but Sarah sees Ishmael doing things that she dislikes. It's not, yes, the inheritance is clearly a factor, but she doesn't like something that Ishmael is doing. She sees the son of Hagar, the Egyptian, doing something called metzachek in Hebrew. He is metzachek. He is playing, according to our translation here, playing. Rashi says.
Can I say something?
Yeah.
Mesachek means play. Metzachek means making fun of.
Right, in modern Hebrew, metzachek means making fun of. And it's the same root as laughter, yitzchak. The passive is laughing. The active in modern Hebrew, metzachek, making fun of. Rashi says making sport. According to Rashi, making sport means worshiping idols. As it is said, that same word is said in reference to the golden calf later on. Another example, letzachek is used in relation to Potiphar's wife. That Potiphar claims that Joseph is metzachek. So she's clearly worried about something that Ishmael is doing.
but she wasn't worried before.
Now she's worried that it will affect her own
Oh,
child.
yeah.
Right, she's worried that this is going to affect her child, right? She wasn't, this worry doesn't come up, right? This is the first time we hear of this, is once Isaac is now growing up. Before Isaac was growing up, we know Ishmael was already, growing up, and it wasn't, right, this clearly wasn't an issue that was raised in the Torah.
What's the difference in age between them?
30 years.
But we already learned that Ishmael was 13, and that was then, now a year has passed, so we would assume based on the text that they're about 14 years older, so he's actually considerably older, if you follow the text, of course. Rashi, sometimes the text is challenging in regards to time. Rashi, in fact, is famously known for saying there is no before and after in the Torah, to try to get around the fact that sometimes the timelines don't match up.
Yeah.
What I was trying to make
Is
that, not only was it 14 years before between them, but Yitzchak had already been weaned, so he's probably, Ishmael here is 17, 18 probably.
Right, if we follow that timeline,
And
Ishmael is actually much
older, not 1,000 period of it.
What? Yeah, okay, yeah.
Point. So here's my question. Why did God save the life of Ishmael? Who eventually his descendants become the Arab nation, who to this day are our nemesis.
So, well, actually, if you read in the Torah earlier, there are other nations, prior, but we do understand Ishmael as the father of the nations. One, that may be a modern read to some degree. Ishmael is, in the Torah, is a son of Abraham. And Abraham is blessed, and through Abraham everyone shall be blessed. And Ishmael is a child of Abraham. And in the Torah's eyes, in some ways, and perhaps today, nations around the world maybe have not done as good a job of recognizing that we're brethren, essentially. But from the Torah, the children of Ishmael, although it's not Bnei Israel, they are children of Abraham, and so they're part of Abraham's blessing. And in fact, that's why God says, right? I will make a nation of him too, for he is your seed.
Right.
That Ishmael needs to be blessed because of Abraham, because it's through Abraham that God has promised Abraham that blessing.
Turn off the kitchen light.
I think someone's.
And so one of the things that bothers me, I understand Abraham was told by God to go ahead and throw Ishmael out. But why did he throw him out with just a little bit of water? Why did he provide for him? That would really bother me.
So interesting. So it's our tradition actually, and the commentary actually reads this as a positive, that he provided him with something.
So little that there was a problem, or a perceived problem.
Well, right. Well, he gave, but it wasn't enough, of course, to sustain them for him. But right, did Abraham do enough? It's a question. Abraham may know from God's word that God is going to care for them, and ultimately that is what happens, right? God heard the cry of the boy, and an angel came, and that's ultimately what happens, that God does provide. But it's an interesting question. Should Abraham have done more? Should, from a modern perspective, should Abraham ever have thrown them out? Right. But God, God does say.
I'm giving him a pass on throwing them out because God said to go ahead and do it.
Right.
But
God does.
I'm not giving him a pass on how little provision.
Okay. Fair.
Because that would have said Sarah.
I would make a seed out of him. But he could have sent him with nothing, because otherwise.
But Abraham didn't necessarily need to send him with anything, right? And that's actually how the tradition reads it, is that this was like a niceness that wasn't even necessary, because he already knew God was going to take care of him. But it's an interesting point, yeah.
Can we infer from that sentence where God said between your wife, that's why, traditionally the husband is supposed to refer or defer to the wife?
Interesting. So our commentary talks about Sarah. Here I want to read. I have some of the commentary here. So Rambam says, Rambam says Ishmael was 16 years old at this point.
Makes sense.
And according to Rambam, exactly, Sarah did not want him to remain in the same household any longer, so that he would not get ideas about sharing in the inheritance with Yitzchak.
Or he could possibly even kill Yitzchak. To make sure.
Right, I don't know that's not necessarily what Sarah's thinking or how we understand Sarah's thinking, but but we learn already from Cain and Abel, right? That what child can kill, it could go as far as killing.
Yes.
So why does God tell Abraham, Sarah? This is what Rashi says, and it's from the Tanchuma, from the Midrash. We may infer that Abraham was inferior to Sarah in respect to prophecy. This is already Rashi and earlier. So there's texts that say Sarah was the greater prophet than Abraham.
Don't they say that also about Yitzchak and Yaakov? That's why we include the imachot. That the women.
Yeah, no, there is. This text does say that the
They're
women.
more perceptive.
The women, right? women were more perceptive, had a greater gift, for prophecy even than Abraham. And this uses this verse to say it. God tells Abraham to listen to Sarah because Sarah is gifted with greater prophecy than Abraham.
That would be a case also from.
And Kol Asher Tomar Radak, who's another prominent commentator, says these words, Kol Asher, listen to everything she says, as indication right in this text that this was not a carte blanche for Sarah, except in the matter of Ishmael and Hagar. The point is rather, so Radak says that it's not carte blanche, it's only in this matter. But there's different interpretations, but Rashi quotes a source that says this verse is actually the proof text that women are greater in prophecy than men.
You could also.
Or Sarah is greater than Abraham, but it's continued on.
You could also make a case when God is a male, you can deduce God is a male from this. Yeah, I only think like a man. I mean, men and women do think differently. And, that he's a man, because he says, okay, Sarah understands this better than I do, I'm a man. And if you wanna make a case for it, we're good at that.
How much of it is that when we get the text itself, who's telling the story? So that more often than not, whoever is telling the story will give those pronouns, whoever they're telling the story about. So if it's a male person telling the story,
Exactly.
they're gonna say God's male. So that might be where some of that's coming of why there could be speculation that.
Well, I'm sure it was the males who were writing the book, so yeah.
It's possible. But I want to jump back here. We don't have too much more time, but this notion of Metzachek, I want to read. That Ishmael is playing, and our tradition generally puts Ishmael in a bad light, that Ishmael is playing sport, although the Torah doesn't really, it's not really directly in the Torah that Ishmael is this wicked, evil person. A lot of that is kind of put on later to help, our rabbinic, ancestors kind of understand why Ishmael could just be thrown out, like this to some degree, I think. But Metzachek, is an interesting verse. There's actually a name, and Yitzchak is a shortened name from scholars of ancient Near East. There was a name El Yitzchak, that God laughs. The name literally God laughs. And this was a name, as scholars of the ancient Near East have discovered, is a name that's in reference to the laughter of the gods. We don't think of our God as a God necessarily as laughing. It was seen more as merriment, and it was a name that was taken from a pagan theology that the gods are full, that the gods are laughing and merriment and having parties with one another. And from a biblical scholarship standpoint, from an ancient Near East scholarship standpoint, taking the name Yitzchak and co-opting it from what was its pagan roots and saying, no, we can have laughter, that there's laughter, because the laughter isn't the gods and merriment, but the laughter is that no, your gods are meaningless, are worthless, and really we're laughing because really God, our God, is in control of everything. And that we saw throughout the story, that it's God that may be causing the barrenness, that God is bringing the child, that God is saying to Abraham, look, Ishmael can go, I'm going to be with him. That God is demonstrating God's superiority and over the story, and that's really a changed point of view from the worldview of the time that these stories were written and the time that these took place. That El Yitzchak was actually the common name, which literally was actually really a pagan idea that the gods are laughing. And here we've taken it on its face, and no, we are laughing because we're laughing at the ridiculousness, the silliness of the gods laughing, and playing. And really it's our laughter because, we didn't realize here God is really in control of it. I don't know if there's any thoughts on that idea. But this Yitzchak, I think, is powerful. Both the laughter and the joy that he gives Abraham and Sarah, and also the laughter, how could this happen? And God is doing it. But here, God is really, Yitzchak is almost a symbol of the laughter that we have, because we recognize and have faith in God, and God is really in control, and not the gods of the communities around him. So we'll just finish here, right? The reading goes on through the end of the chapter today. But ultimately, right, Ishmael is made a great nation as well, and the Arab nations, right, see themselves as descendants of Ishmael to this day. And we kind of learn the story. There's right, the Avimelech comes back. We learn kind of Abraham's dealings with the kings of his region and of his area, and that Abraham himself was a great leader in the community around as well. And all of this leads up to, right, this moment tomorrow in our Torah reading, that here Abraham is this great leader. He's been shown to stand up to God. He's distressed about sending off his son, but does so because he knows God will make him a great nation. And this great leader is ready and willing to make the ultimate sacrifice of his child, Yitzchak, the one who is causing laughter, the one who is who shows God's power over the way the world works. And perhaps because Abraham knows that message, that maybe that's why when Abraham hears this message directly to him, maybe Abraham realizes, oh, this is, what I need to do. And maybe you could argue whether Abraham knows there's going to be a sacrifice or not. There's different texts, different understandings of whether Abraham really thinks that he's going to go ahead with sacrificing his son. But he knows, Yitzchak, Abraham knows that God really is the one in control and really, weaving the narrative of this story. So any last thoughts? And then
Okay, and one last thing. Again, tying it in why this parsha.
Yeah.
So I was reading some of the commentary and the word fear for sorrow was repeated a few times.
Mhm.
So I'm thinking, aha, that's the tie-in. Because the liturgy today and tomorrow, or I thought Rosh Hashanah, Happy New Year, oh my God. When you read what you are praying, you are praying for your life today and tomorrow.
Yeah, no, it's true, right? We think of
Is not, it's a very powerful, the words that we pray tomorrow, day and tomorrow. The gates are slowly creeping closed, and and on Yom Kippur. So they're very profound. And I think there is a lot of fear because fear of the unknown.
right, no, very much, right? It's very different from, December 31st and New Year's. We think of,
Yes.
joy. Here it's right, it's a very serious moment. Yeah,
I associate the word fear more with Yaakov than Sarah. It appears more about Yaakov.
what appears? The word
The
fear.
word fear.
Okay. Yeah.
I would have thought that the liturgy of Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur is so profound, as she points out. Just we could just put everything aside and spend a few years just studying the Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur davening, because it's so fundamental, fundamental about our existence, belief in God. And if one believes God controls everything, it would seem to me that could, in a way, desensitize people to other people's pain. Well, it's God's will. It's God's will. Somebody's suffering over the loss of a loved one, and well, it's all God's will. So I think there are different ways of looking at that.
No, right, definitely. There are different ways of looking at it, and it's challenging. In some ways, the High Holiday liturgy is challenging. But I think it also provides a reminder, it causes us pause for reflection. in our lives, and to, I think, one, to take account of, you know, of where we are, of the things we've done, of the people that we want to be in the year to come. But also, you know, to submit in a sense, to recognize that, you know, we want to believe, right, that God's hand is there. And that's why we're praying, you know, the words are very solemn, but there's this sense, this desire that God will be guiding us, you know, for a year of health and happiness. And you know, whether you believe it literally or whether you believe it metaphorically, or you know, that's really the imagery of Rosh Hashanah. Is the serious nature, taking account, cheshbon hanefesh, taking account of where we've been, of what we've done, and taking this moment to pray. It's not only the words that we say tzedakah, utshuvah, tefillah, that we do these three things to help bring us into the next year.
Interesting
Yeah.
to conduct a study of different people and their perceptions of which prayers are most meaningful to them. And I think that Unasana Tokef is really, to me, in my mind, stands out. Who shall live, who shall die, who by fire, who by water. What happened recently in Libya and so forth with these natural disasters is really poignant,
Yes.
Because Leonard Cohen made a big thing out of that Unasana Tokef in a way.
Yeah.
And
No, it is, the liturgy is very powerful, and you know, I encourage everyone to find the prayers that are really that you connect most with. I want to say to everyone, from our liturgy, right, may we all be inscribed and written in the book of life for a sweet and happy and healthy new year.
And thank you.
Safe new year.
Thank you.
And great to learn a little with everyone. The services are underway here in the check.
Get my water.
But yeah, thank you.
And I put that-